Okay, so it looks like we've got some folks joining now. So on behalf of Teachers College Press, I'd like to welcome you all to the book launch for Just Schools, Building Equitable Collaborations with Families and Communities by Dr. Ann Ishimaru. Just so everyone's aware, we are recording this event and it will be available on YouTube in a few days' time. We will be accepting questions and please, if you can, put those in the chat panel or in the Q&A box using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll get to those at the end of the hour. Also at the end of the hour, we'll be having a giveaway for a free copy of the book. So please be sure to stick around for the entire hour for your chance to win a free copy of Just Schools. And please also be sure to talk about the event on social media. We're going to be putting the information for all of the panelists and the press, as well as the hashtag for the book in the chat panel that you see on the right side of your screen. There's also a link there where you can purchase the book at a 15% discount with the coupon code mentioned in the chat. And finally, if you're a professor, you can also visit that link to get an exam copy. But I think that takes care of the housekeeping. So at this point, I'm gonna hand it over to Dr. Ann Ishimaru, our author and the Woman of the Hour.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ann Ishimaru, and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Duwamish and the Coast Salish in Seattle, Washington. And I'm so honored to be joined today by two brilliant scholars and beautiful human beings, Dr. Megan Bang and Dr. Mohammed Khalifa. And we're going to be talking a little bit about Just Schools, a new book from Teachers College Press. And I'll tell you a little bit about the book if you haven't had a chance to get a hold of it and read it yet. But I wanted to start with a little bit about myself and then ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves a little bit. So I am on the faculty at the University of Washington in Seattle. I've been here for about 8 years now. I'm also the mom of 3 kids who are about to start online schooling, auntie to 3 more kids. I've also been a community leader, an organizer, middle school science teacher, an environmental educator, and a professional taiko player. So point for you if you know what that means. I want to name that this book, frankly, just like all the rest of my work, it owes its existence to a whole host of collaborators, research partners, mentors, students, and of course my own chosen and given family, some of whom are likely here today with us. Special thanks to Mom and Dad, who I think are calling in today from California. And I know that you want to hear about the book, but I can't think of a better way for you all to dig into the ideas in the book. Discussing the big ideas that undergird it with these 2 folks who I've had the fortune to collaborate with and to learn from over the years. I just want to say a little bit about how they figure into the work in the book. Well, one is that we are doing very synergistic work. We do a lot of work that nourishes each other's thinking and efforts, and we have some shared stances and starting places. At the same time, we also bring very different perspectives, communities, and histories, and that allows us to engage in some, I think, really rich thinking and working and pushing each other's thinking. So I want to start with Megan Bang. I'm especially indebted to learn from Megan so much about what it looks like for someone to live in the world in a way that's really consistent with who she is, to live indigeneity in the world and in the work. And she holds so much of the beauty and trauma and resurgence as well of indigenous communities, and does it in ways that really shows the way forward for the rest of us, not just as scholars, but as community members, as parents, as family members. And, you know, we exist in these very colonizing fields and endeavors and institutions, so it always gives me life to witness her transform conversations and possibilities. And I particularly appreciate the way that she's taught me to examine and look at the moment to moment as a kind of microcosm of a much more complex system that's both rooted in history and an opportunity to realize the future in that particular moment. I also want to introduce Dr. Mohammed Khalifa, who shows me every day what it is to move with fierce love as a spiritually anchored, unapologetic Black man, and a son and a brother and a father. He has this gift of holding space that allows for sort of, that's a no-nonsense space, but also invites others in and leads in ways that are about solidarity with communities of color and with women of color. And I really am indebted to him for learning about the higher calling of educational leadership to community leadership, and the ability to recognize and name the deep ancestral knowledges that are a resource for the kinds of transformations we hope to see. So I'm really indebted to both of you for many of the core ideas in this book, even if they're not present in every study or context. And now I'm going to let them introduce themselves the way they'd like to be introduced.
Megan, you first, my sister.
Bonjour, Badaba Nkwe, Edition Cost and Anishinaabe. I'm calling in from the original territories of the Three Fires people, currently named Chicago. And I just want to both start by saying thank you, Anne, for inviting us. I'm so proud of you and so proud of this work, and really just excited to have this conversation. And I was really excited to have the three of us in conversation. I kind of feel like we're co-conspirators in this work. And so it's fun to be able to have this kind of what I see as a real celebratory moment in a really critical time. I guess for everyone else on the call, I'll say I am a professor of learning sciences and psychology at Northwestern. And I like to think about transformative learning. And for me, it's always about how does education become the place of medicine for our communities instead of its historical rootings in harm. And so this book, and I think that work is really important. And I guess I'll say this, is that I often think about the work of being a scholar as a tool towards life work. And I just want to honor both of you to say that you all have helped my life work. And yes, you've helped kind of the tools of the academy or the other kinds of work to do that life work. I think I'll also just say I come to this conversation as a mom, as a grandma, as an auntie, as someone who's already really flabbergasted by what the next year is supposed to hold for my children and my grandchildren. And I'm really excited about this because I think we need to have some really bold conversations and some really clear ways of thinking about the big scale changes that we really need. And so I hope we get to do that today and figure out ways to do that continually in a collective way. So thanks.
Well, I could have been doing anything this Friday afternoon, just, chilling with the family, which is what we normally do. I couldn't be more honored to be here with you two. You both have really said very kind things. And I think that there's no way for me to match saying how much I appreciate you two as a part of my life, as a part of my journey, and to have been in projects with you that really have just shaped my thinking and set me on a new trajectory. So thank you for that. I am Mohammed Khalifa. I just recently joined the faculty of Ohio State University. I spent some time in Minnesota and Michigan before that. I like to look at how school leaders can help decolonize schools. I'm trying to figure some things out with that. And I've been kind of calling it different things over the years, deeply shaped by both Ann and Megan in that journey of trying to figure out how, given that school leaders are often, unfortunately, it's the roles they inherited are often the enforcers of colonized schoolings or coloniality. And by definition, that's what some of the roles are. So since we can't take all school leaders or all schools out, we have to learn how to live with this complexity. And I try to address such questions in my research by both going into schools and working with them hand to hand. I used to publish a lot of scholarly research, and now I'm trying to do more in-person work and other projects that might help contribute to the process. And I'm so happy to be talking about this work because we talk about this a lot from a macro level and from a theoretical level. And this book really gives us the deep, very, very precise view that we need in order to continue doing this work. So thank you for writing it, Anne, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to give just a brief overview of some of the big ideas in the book, and then we'll just jump in. We'll spend the bulk of our time in a kind of free-flowing discussion. Then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. But I also want to just give you all a heads up that the three of us have fun going deep pretty fast. And so that means that this isn't going to be necessarily a conversation tailored to the folks who are new to thinking about these ideas. That's great, and you're welcome if you are. But you know, we're particularly dug into this kind of work, and if you came, just to be frank, if you came to find out how to get families to do what schools want, this is probably not the conversation that's going to yield what you were looking for. But that's kind of the context for the book, and eventually the question that I'm going to get us to. But I want to start by just acknowledging the sort of moment that we're in and the realities of the world at this moment. Not only are we dealing with this pandemic, but we're in the midst of a reckoning with racism, with anti-Black the violence in particular, which is tied to the ongoing colonization of indigenous communities whose lands we're on. And we've got this kind of broader awareness that's emerging in our country about the violence and the dynamics of racism, and those aren't new in any way. And all of those dynamics are also tied to the ways that schools relate to Black, Indigenous, and people of color youth and their families. And so one of the key premises of the book is that we need to figure out how to shift out of our current paradigm in terms of the relationship between families and schools. So we have this dominant paradigm that's kind of focused on quote unquote engaging families. That's all about educating them individually to better support their children to do school better. And in practice, what this often means is that we're asking parents and caregivers, especially from communities of color, to act kind of like what Megan and I have talked about as complaints officers for school expectations around things like attendance, around behavior, around doing homework. And in this moment of the pandemic schooling moment, that dynamic, if anything, is getting amped up. So we have to make sure that our kids get up in time, they're in front of the screens, they're getting attendance taken. Some schools have policies like they're forbidding certain clothing or hoodies, they're requiring the web cameras to be on, they're prohibiting kids from eating during the class. And so it's up to parents and caregivers to be the enforcers of those things as those kinds of policies and dynamics amp up. So one of the things that happens a lot is people think, oh, well, let's communicate better, let's translate these things into different languages. But one of the stances of the book is like, no matter how many languages you translate that kind of stuff into, we're still doing things to students and families in ways that often reinforce the existing racial inequities in them. So the shift has to do with recognizing the expertise of families of color and recognizing that educators and schools and broader educational systems need that expertise if we're going to do better. And by families, we mean also, it doesn't necessarily mean sort of in the narrow sense parents, biological parents. Also, we're talking about extended families. Grandparents could be non-biological, aunties or uncles, siblings, and youth themselves. And I think collectively, the book argues that families hold an essential piece of the puzzle for educational justice and community well-being. So I tried to weave together roughly a decade of empirical work. And I tried to do it in a way that was not just about portraying the problem, because I think that we have a lot of really powerful, important, and foundational work on the problem. I wanted to begin to offer some possibilities, some vision about what does it look like to do things differently and how we might realize a different paradigm. And the work happens at a variety of different levels, and so that's how I structured the book. After the opening chapters, each chapter features a different level where we need to think about the intersection between families and schools or educational systems. So it starts with this really broader ecosystem that includes all of the organizations, people, networks, places, and spaces where children and families are growing and learning. Then we go thinking about district policies and initiatives, then schools and organization-wide dynamics and practices, and then all the way to the everyday individual interactions between parents and educators. So that's a lot of level and complexity. And one of the ways I tried to tie it together was to weave through these 4 principles that have emerged across the studies. These are going to sound really familiar to Mohammed and Megan. Beginning with families and communities, transforming power, building reciprocity and agency, and then undertaking change as inquiry. So finally kind of get to my first question here. One of the things I want to say is, and I think as we know, there's not anything really new here, right? Like we folks in communities of color have been having these conversations for a long time. Some of these bodies of work have existed for a long time. And yet suddenly, because of all of these other dynamics, families and racial justice have become at the center of conversations in education after being on the margins for so long. So I just want to start to ask us to think a little bit about like, what are the dangers and possibilities of this particular moment, and how should we help folks challenge the dominant approaches to families and education right now?
Go ahead, Muhammad. You can go first.
Well, I think one of the dangers, well, first of all, Anna, I do think that you have something that you're stating in a way that people haven't stated it before. I mean, I'm not going to use the term new, but I haven't seen someone so clearly articulate how like community and decolonial epistemologies can really influence the macro level of schools. I haven't seen someone articulate it so clearly and so powerfully. So I do think that that's kind of new. So let me first say that. But I think that danger is that, you know, the community voice and rage is on full display. And because of multiple, as Megan says, twin pandemics. And you know, the COVID and the George Floyd and now Jacob. I mean, I should just say police killing of Black men. And I think that when the rage and the voice is on full display, one of the dangers is that, number one, it becomes almost like monotone. People don't want to hear it. Right now, we are in a moment, I think, where people do want to hear it. But if the voice is heard and not responded to, both sides walk away with a sense of despondency, I think. Educators are saying, okay, we've heard this before. And if nothing happens and it doesn't, I mean, if you can persistently kill unarmed Black men and nothing happens and nothing changes in education, I don't know what level of apathy we would need to get to really in order for something to happen. So by the voice and the rage being on full display, systems that hope to maintain the current structures and the way things happen now can use that to sort of maneuver. You know, when slaves revolt, what happens is that, you know, slave owners and slaveholders get more savvy about how the revolts happen or the escapes happen, you know. So when resistance is, I don't mean to go critical immediately like this, but when resistance is on full display like that, we have to be very careful as scholars and as community activists about how we respond to that, how we hear that, because it could be a time where, you know, we don't try to stay in more positive spaces and we kind of just allow those things to push us in negative ways. All right, so that's one of the dangers. Possibilities is that since so many things are happening right now, both the pandemic and I've never seen a more clear path of educators having access to community-based epistemologies than now. I've never seen educators so more close in proximity to it than now, ever in my entire life. I mean, I've read about that from community-based situations in the past and stuff like that, but I've never ever seen such a clear path. That's one thing. So I think that we have a very unique possibility about what can we retain. And Dr. Bang and I and Ann have been talking about this offline. What can we retain as we move past this moment from raw emotion, which is good and where we are now, into a moment of, you know, as a leader person, I have to ask, as a moment of systematizing so the proximity we have to that indigenous and decolonial and ancestral knowledge. So those are a couple of things that come to mind right now. Ann, did you want to?
Maybe I'll riff on that a little bit.
Yes, please, Megan.
So here on all of those things, because I think, you know, one of the things that I think is potentially unique in this moment is that the twin pandemics are asking people to act for each other differently than I think two kinds of things have before. And it's an interesting thing where, you know, I mean, I've told people this, that it is an interesting thing that people are faced with daily decisions that are actually in other people's well-being, right? Deciding to wear a mask is actually more for the other than it is for self. And the United States doesn't do that. The United States is actually predicated on the opposite ethic and has been for a long time, right? And then it powers it in particular kinds of ways. And I feel like, Mohammed, to your point, that we're in a moment where people seem to be listening to the long scale forms of violence that people have been surviving differently than perhaps before. And so in my hopefulness, I feel like perhaps the landscape of our ethical possibilities have shifted. Like, it's my hope that people recognize like the value shift that has to happen, we have the opportunity to actually do. And I feel like you're pointing to the proximity of, we have educators closer to families than they have been in a long time. I completely agree. I also think we have family life restored to the center of life for the first time in multiple generations, right? Like, we haven't lived like this for many generations, and in large part because of the ways that work changed family and community life, particularly amongst the Industrial Revolution and previous world wars. But what's interesting to me about that is the contradiction of our economic systems with the well-being of our families is totally on display. And our school systems are having to grapple with being in the middle of those things right now in a way that I don't, and that has been an ongoing problem, right? Like, we know that kids aren't totally motivated by like, go to school so you can get a good job. Like, that's not a logic that raises thriving children. That's not a logic that makes people dig in deeply into becoming who they can become. Like, and so some of that is like revealing some of the problematic logics that have been in play, that have been driving school change. And I guess for me, the big challenge is that there is this closeness to proximity, but Anna, I feel like where you started about I am not experiencing that schools decided to see that as good. And for me, I've been kind of running around being like, learning loss narratives are digging deep and doubling down on colonial narratives and racist narratives. So decisions driven by a fear of learning loss continues the paradigm that our children and families don't have activity of worth happening for longer life. And so for me, the danger right now is like recognizing, in many ways, our education systems are in this double bind that is unfair and have been for a long time. But I worry we've leaned, and our decision-making has leaned and been pressured to lean further away from, I think, the possibility, Mohammed, that you laid out, that there is a possible proximity that could be operating with a different intent and logic and ethic more than ever before. But the danger is that we do that and actually we get tighter in problematic things. And so I feel like we're in this really interesting crossroads of like, do we recognize, and I say this to my kids all the time, I say to them, look, when you tell the story of how you started high school during a pandemic, the biggest one in human history where everybody could see it because we've never had technology to recognize a global pandemic before, I don't want your big story to be, but I passed my English class. That's not wisdom that brings next generations through. And right now, like, we have got this weird ahistorical view of things. One of my favorite things I've been doing with people is saying, if we're alive right now, it means we each have an ancestor that survived the Spanish flu pandemic. How'd they do that? What's their story of that? And I just sometimes wish that right now in this moment, we would think about the big picture and what is really important. And if we don't, if we just push the pre-COVID as like necessary, I think we will be in much worse situations.
So here's the thing that I keep coming to, because I totally agree with you, Mohammed, that there's this proximity thing. I know there's a way in which we're all kind of reaching because we're seeing, well, I speak for myself, because I'm seeing a lot of things moving in directions that are not towards the kind of reimagining that I had hoped. But I feel like, you know, like when we actually dig into those epistemology, really listen to what families are saying, that's exactly what they'll say, right? What Megan, you were just talking about is like, I've been having a lot of conversations with families of color recently, and they're, it's not like they don't care about the, you know, like the conventional measures of schooling, but they're really concerned about their children's well-being, how they are going to be in the world, how they're developing their ability to like care for others, to take responsibility. And those are, I guess, the two pieces of that I struggle with a little bit is like, on the one hand, I have this, there's this dynamic always where people are saying like, oh, well, we did a survey from the systems point of view, or we're doing some listening sessions. So we're listening to what families are saying, and we've got, like, we're taking advantage of this moment because we recognize that, the rhetoric is, parents are their first teachers. And I guess to me, those efforts often feel like they're reinscribing the sort of problematic dynamic where parents feel like they share their concerns and their aspirations, and then systems say, yes, we've heard you, and then they go off and they make decisions that they say were informed by the surveys and the listening sessions and all that kind of stuff. And in some ways, it actually like makes families feel even more that these systems aren't engaging with them. So I'm struggling with like, what does it look like to not just listen, but to enact these kinds of things? How do we especially carve out space? Because I feel like districts have been good about hearing, oh, we didn't all have technology. We need to all have technology, or we need to make sure that we keep the food consistent. Those things are really critically important, and they're sort of insufficient. And so I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on those kinds of practices and how you might talk with leaders in particular about the kinds of ways that we might actually enact those things differently, and then two, how we carve out the space for bigger imagining than what are the constraints right in front of us. How do we get out of just reaction mode?
Read chapter 5, 6, and 7 of your book. Is my first
I have a few thoughts about that. I'd love to hear what you all think.
Well, I'll say one thing, and then I know Mohammed has been doing this in deep ways. I mean, and you and I know this, and we've been talking about this, but I'll just hold up what you just said, is that I think, and I actually think this is connected to, Mohammed, your point about like, we have a lot on display right now. And it positions everyone to be listening to display. And I think this is connected. I think we have a practice in this society where people in power think that an inclusive move is to hear our voices and then go and make those decisions. And I think that there's a systemic way that that's played out, and really that we haven't shifted who's making decisions or how they're making decisions when we get into voice or representation politics as the levers of change. And so I think, your book goes deeply into what does it mean to co-design, and what does it mean to actually reimagine and see it as an ongoing way to imagine a different sort of interaction. And part of, we've talked about this a lot, but I'm saying this partly for all of us, is that I think that we have a kind of settledness about role and institution that I would argue is partly about a kind of ways that power is maintained. And certainly Cheryl Harris's sort of whiteness as property, I think, has propagated across society about how a solidity of roles, and I've thought about this as desettled, is part of the problem. And so part of what I feel like co-designing, and part of what I think your book is pointing to, is that we have to actually reimagine porous systems where people's expertise come to the table, and that there isn't a clear singularity of role. And I think that that's partly, for me, that's a restorative act of seeing people's complex humanities, right? That like part of what happens is people construct people in narrow ways where you get to have a singular role, and it's part of a dehumanizing process always. And so, and I think that goes to the ways that visioning often asks people to put their trauma on display for public consumption. And that it cultivates people telling, this is how bad things are, right? And that sometimes it gets to like, tell us what you think we should do. But I think what's really important about your work is showing that through co-design, it's things like racialized institutional scripts that get transformed over time, and the kinds of ways that those scripts actually seep into everything, it takes time to meaningfully peel those back and to be able to see them so that you can actually see what it means to do something. And I think that I think the listening sessions expect a kind of grandeur of scale of change that sets us all up for disappointment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mom.
No, go ahead, Ann.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, one of the pieces that Megan and I are working on right now is really thinking about even just there's this kind of simple thing of like the listening sessions. Not only is like the grand scale, but we get this, it's this one-off moment, and so even having multiple engagements over time does something to change the kinds of conversations and the kinds of reimaginings that we can engage with. And so we saw actually in the Family Leadership Design Collaborative, the project that we've been involved in, across these very different contexts, that there's a shift in the kinds of aims that people are talking about when they're able to be in these conversations over time.
Yeah, I hate to keep going back to enslavement moments, but when masters come on Sunday afternoon after they work their slaves all week in the afternoon and say, well, how are things going? To me, so communities of color have history with officials of this country and have history with schools. Kill the Indian, save the man. There are deep histories, and for us to show up in schools now and act like those histories, I mean, you know, of course, we educators, we have narratives about communities of color, but communities of color have narratives and discourses about educators as well. And that's predicated on history. So I don't think that the window dressing, the listening set, I mean, should you keep doing the surveys and listening sessions? Yes, keep doing that. But is that enough? No. And the reason why is because, and one thing I love beautifully about your book, and you used a parable in the book where you said something about building the car and you had the drivers, but now where do we drive to? Well, I think that where you drive to is what can drive authentic communication. So I'm glad you emphasized that in the book, because if educators are not willing to, and in particular leaders with the history, now keep this history in mind that we are all reflecting on, and you show up, it can be seen as disingenuous, and it can even be exoticizing if you're not taking serious the needs and the pain and the fact that you've trained these parents to mimic and to say what you expect them to say. So there has to be a type of decolonial literacy that you hear from the people in the community on the one hand, but at the same time you're talking about, look, these are the ways that we have colonized your voice. These are the ways that we push you into saying things that I can tell you, but schools have to figure out by working with people like Megan and like Ann, how to get to the authentic voice, both the pain and the promise in the future of these communities. And I think that advocacy plays a key role in that. So, you know, leaders who are willing to have humility, and educators who are willing to have humility and go to the communities and learn from those communities in non-exoticizing or tokenizing ways, and then picking up those causes, regardless of the fact if they have anything to do with education or not, I think is a starting point.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the questions here that kind of relate to that. I think that they're kind of a good jumping off point. Thinking about one person's asking, how do leaders engage with and authentically serve families, caregivers, and communities when this requires them to reject or even create active conflict with the policy forces that police, I don't know if that was unintentional or not, schools. And I think that what you just mentioned, Mohammed, is really key there, sort of recognizing that that the role of formal leaders may be actually to push against some of the things that they've been selected to uphold. And I think that's complex space for leaders to navigate. And if we don't hold the kind of histories that reside in schools as institutions, and just think that as an educational leader, our job is to kind of uphold and do whatever the school says. We are going to inadvertently just be reinforcing all of the historical dynamics that you just named.
Absolutely. And I think educators know this. Many of the educators who I speak with do know it. And it's just about, us all, collectively saying that we're not going to do it the same way. And you can ask any of the leaders on the call that their jobs are really not stable anyway. So it's not like that should be something that will stop them from dehumanizing students. And how can somebody read this book and walk away not knowing that, especially in the earlier parts when you outlaid some of this history, that they're not reinscribing and contributing to dehumanization of communities and schools,
You know,
one thing, oh, go ahead.
I just want to say that one of the things that, and I think is in your book, and I've watched you do increasingly, is also ask leaders to think about how we use our power and privilege differently, right? And I think that sometimes what happens is that people under-engage and take seriously the power that they have in a system. And I've watched you organize school district leaders in different kinds of ways to collectively organize and move towards solidarity. And I feel like you outlined that in your book nicely, but I think it's worth people making sure that we also don't position leaders as singular or on their own, right? Because that's not, it's part of what I think is really important about kind of co-designing for solidarities and recognizing that part of the work is doing that collective strategy together. And I think the reduction to like, this is what my job tells me to do. Well, leadership is, if we're serious about leadership, then it's not all received about what we're supposed to do. And I think that like figuring out how we hold each other up in kind of being leaders that actually are after transforming our systems is a really important part that I think your book starts to lay out too, and what it takes for the principals to do that. I would argue, Mohammed, your work is doing that as well. But I think it's important as people think about the challenge of it. It also, if we look at how districts have been left or states have been left to figure it out on their own, we've been watched a kind of full scale, what happens when you don't collectivize and think about strategic collective action about something. It's on full display about that problematic orientation too.
For sure. I think one of the other questions has to do with sort of the dehumanization in our systems around the ways that those roles get constructed so deeply that we can't even see them sometimes. And I think Keisha Scarlett, who's one of the co-authors in the final chapter, we were just doing this webinar and she was sharing a kind of a story of when she entered into a space that there's this kind of this all or nothing, there's all these binaries that crop up in this kind of work. And so she was trying to be very aware of the power that she had and the positionality, and she was like, oh, I felt like the man in there. So she was just like, well, I'm a nobody, I'm just sitting here, I'm just going to take notes. And the way that she tells it, I don't remember exactly saying this to her, but she said we were discussing it, and I said to her apparently, well, that's kind of dishonest, isn't it? And and what we kind of unpacked is just sort of recognizing that, yes, she is a leader in a district. Yes, she does have positional authority and power. And she also brings these other identities. She's a mother, she's African-American, she grew up in these neighborhoods. And there's a way in which when even like the moves to say, I'm going to share power, end up being like, oh, I have no power. I'm going to put all the power in families. And my job is just to get out of the way and do nothing. And there's something there, and that's what we were kind of pressing on, is just like, wait a minute, that's actually not who you are. You actually do have some formal authority and power. And then the question then becomes, how can you use that? And how can you move in solidarity with families and communities? And so like to the point about the sort of, we have a really individualistic conception of what leadership is. Not only are we stuck on this idea of it's the person in the title, but we also have this like someone, it's like the some of the foundational pieces of literature like define it as being an individual who exerts influence on other people. And I think one of the things that tapping the kinds of ancestral knowledges that Muhammad is helping us to attend to is really recognizing that leadership is, I always talk about the difference between leading as a noun, leading as a verb. And thinking about, even for the individual leader within a system, whether it's a principal or a district leader, that there's actually a kind of collective there that if we know how to find it, identify it, and move in different ways in relation, there are families and there are communities who can be part of this, more of a coalition in enacting leadership. And I think that that's the thing that a lot of times formal leaders get stuck on. They feel like, oh, I'm in the system, I'm fighting, and I'm all by myself, and I'm going to lose my job. And yeah, that's a real possibility. And if we can begin to broaden the view to think about leadership more collectively, then that opens the door to moving in more, my made up English word for that is solidariously, and gets us something different than, as a leader, I'm just going to stand in the background and be the, like the furniture, and then y'all go do everything. So it's something that's like, I feel like challenging sometimes for people to hold.
Megan, you want to jump in on this one first? Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. I'll start us off in this. See, people who don't know Megan and I, we get each other going. So I'm gonna start off, and then her wheels are gonna just then her explosion can be louder. So no, I'll say though, what's ironic about what you're saying, Ann, is that, and your book points this out beautifully, is that although leaders don't realize and recognize how to do this work and haven't studied, it's not well theorized in our field. The ironic part is that that's exactly where their power lies. They have no power against the hierarchy. They have no power. I have seen leader after leader who has deep community ties and support lead differently. And then because of the collective and the collaboration, that was the protection for their job, because a lot of leaders are worried about their jobs. It was the communities that saved their jobs. It was the communities that said, you're not letting this person go. And what the person gained as well is because of their closeness to the community, right? And I love how Megan laid out at the beginning of this call, how the proximity and how Anna's been emphasizing, it has to mean something aside from closeness. It has to mean that we can begin to learn from the communities because of the proximity, and we can begin to take that. And so I think leaders who advocate for issues in the community, they learn from it. It is a process. It is a product, but it's a process as well of you growing close to people, of you earning their trust, of you establishing that kind of rapport you need. And I believe that, and I've seen in some of my own work and others, many other people who have researched the same thing, that this advocacy and this closeness can get people to lead differently with that indigenous and ancestral knowledge in mind. And so the collective is, I mean, yes, there's sort of an external thing where people can look and see the collective, but then there are all of these other background things happening too that enrich leaders in ways that they could never, ever learn in any other way except by entering communities and sharing that space there. So I want to just...
one of the things that I feel like, Muhammad, you're pushing on right now is that I think that oftentimes we think that leaders somehow have more expertise than everybody else, and that's why they're in that role. And part of what I hear you pushing on is really what I would call around how to see indigenous leadership. And for me, there's always a consent to be led, right? And the assumption is not so much that a leader knows more or is somehow more expert, but there becomes other kinds of skills that those leaders have, and they take up responsibilities and roles in a moment in time, however long that time is. But this point about that, like, leaders have to be in relations with the people they're leading, not assuming that they know what the people they're leading needs. And there's a fundamental shift about that is often not how we've been set up, because Western knowledge systems hands out hierarchical frameworks for knowledge. right? And it's part of the deep part about ancestral knowledges and the differences in the ways that we think that expertise works, but also who's afforded dignity and respect. And I think that that's one of the things that's been most important for me to do in work, to say, degreed expertise doesn't make you expert necessarily in making deep change. And while there's pragmatics of that, and you know, I'm a professor. I do like, I like my nerd words for sure, but I think that this point means that like it's a fundamental shift in the ways that we value each other's lived experiences, and an assumption. I think that one of the other things is that there's a deep anti-intellectualism that gets applied to people now, and that's also a kind of dehumanizing, as if all people didn't have rich, complex knowledge systems, right? As if if you didn't go far in school, you don't have complexity of thought, right? There's a kind of these things that have been put in motion that continue to be exasperated in the ways that our systems are set up. And it works to devaluing families and people who are not in, quote, in recognized positions of power.
Yeah, I was thinking about, I can't remember the context now, but we were having this, there was another one of these panels, and people were really talking about, in some ways, theory as an underdeveloped practice that actually gets, you know, pushed to the margins or disregarded, even though it's always there. And I think, you know, I was thinking a lot also about, you know, I'm looking at some of these questions here, and people grappling, well, first with what is co-design, and then thinking about, you know, there's always these questions of scale and whose voice matters, especially when you think about not only folks who have degrees, which I would actually argue in some ways is a barrier, because folks, there's this weird way, especially for folks in systems, where they feel like they have to represent the system. They wear a particular, you hear people say it all the time, like, I'm wearing my principal hat, and as though taking off the principal hat or being a principal and a human being or a parent or a community member, somehow that those are mutually exclusive. So I think sometimes the degreed expertise piece of it actually acts as a barrier for folks who are in those roles to humanize themselves, and then also, because of the power they have, be able to humanize other people in the space that they're in. But I wanted to just take a second and just kind of unpack a couple of things about co-design, and then ask us to talk a little bit about, I guess, two questions that are coming from Don and Adam, who are doc students of mine. Hi guys. One has to do with, okay, so co-design is I don't know if I can say this succinctly, but you can read it. I wrote it better in the book, I think. A process of sort of deep engagement with each other. And it's an example of a way in which it's not necessarily like, we don't try to do this with like 100 people at a time. Although there are, I often conceptualize it like there are, it's like an accordion. So we might start with smaller groups of folks and have deep conversations that are really dug into who are we and what do we bring to these conversations? What are our histories? What are the histories that we're all a part of? And then how can we not just sort of share stories and build relationships, but also then say, and then how do we build forward from there? How do we create or imagine something different than we have on the table in front of us? How do we try that out? And how do we kind of test that out, talk to other people, gather data? Sometimes that's data about whatever the you know, effort or intervention is, and sometimes it's data about ourselves, the conversations that we have and how we play out power in those conversations. You'll see chapter, I think it's 6. There's a kind of in-depth portrayal of that. But I think one of the questions that people struggle with, and the systems folks especially I hear struggle with this, is like, how do we do that sort of at a statewide level, or at even not at a state level, but at scale? And then how do we, especially if we're doing that in mixed company, as some scholars will say, mixed race company, how do we navigate the dynamics of white privileged families? I've been just listening to this podcast, Nice White Parents, which is I think she does a very nice job of portraying how those things play out So like, I guess there's two questions. One is sort of the scale question that I feel like is always lurking whenever I start talking about co-design. And then the second one being, how do we navigate relative to white privileged families who are pushing particular agendas in particular kinds of ways? And of course, you have only a couple minutes because we're coming to the close of our time.
Well, here's what I'll say one thing about co-design. So I think these are the questions, and I actually think these are the exciting possibilities to continually engage in. And I think that one of the things is that we often think that we're co-designing and then we'll move beyond it. And part of what I think you're arguing for and recognizing is that we're actually talking about co-design as a new system always, right? There isn't a like, will end. If co-designing is about continually improving and thinking about how to set a kind of relations and a kind of dynamics in motion, the question for me about co-design is, how is it that we transform or routinize practices now that currently aren't producing the outcomes that we want, and recognize that we need to fundamentally shift them? And I think that that's the big challenge for all of us, is to think about, how is co-design routinized? Right? And how do we think about it as a continual relational process towards problem solving, but also potentially really exciting. I don't really like the word innovation these days at all, but right, like how is it that we're always cultivating new possibilities? And I think your point about like always new inquiry, your fourth principle, is part of the point here. Like, how do we recognize that like this will be an ongoing thing? And part of what I'll say is that even if you take out, well, you can. What it means to learn to read right now compared to what it meant to learn to read 10 years ago is totally different, right? What the texts are that reach 8-year-olds right now compared to what the texts were in everyday life 10 years ago are different. And if we're developing systems that are responsive, that are engaged, that are actually helping nurture families' lives as they are being lived now, then they're always going to be in motion. And so I think that like that's part of it for me, is the point about co-design is that we have to be thinking about how we're actually re-engaging a system to be in co-design relations with children and families always. It's not a do it once and now you're done. It's routine.
And I will just add very quickly that because I think that Megan is really speaking to the scalability question here, because if it becomes routine and it becomes a part of all processes, interactions and such, I think that does kind of answer the scale question. In terms of holding multiple space with people who have a diverse histories, it is going to be a challenge. But if you, for example, are a district and you're trying to get around this issue of how communities might better engage the law enforcement community, SROs and stuff like that, for example, I think that there has to, I mean, I can't see myself being in a co-design with someone and we have diametrically opposed views of what must happen that rest on the subhumanity of someone that's a part of the co-design. In other words, that humanization has to supersede the goal of the co-design, or we have no co-design together. And so if we can come together on what the goal is, I think that most people of color, and I don't want to speak for all people of color, because some just need affinity spaces, and we all do, and I get that. But I do think that there can be some collaboration on shared goals, and if we can identify what those goals are, I believe that will help mitigate what kind of unique histories exist in this space.
Yeah, we've been thinking a lot about how there's a set of goals or aims, and where we get in trouble. Like one of the ones that Dr. Scarlett talks about is that they came in, they were like, we're going to address chronic absenteeism. And so then they started talking to the families there, and it was like, whoa, wait a minute, that was actually us coming in and imposing that as the goal. And when we actually talk to families, it's not like they don't care about attendance, but there's some pretty much, there are far deeper things there. And so the piece about sort of like, if we dig into a particular kind of process in a particular kind of way, that reshapes what the outcome is, that product. And I think that even like, you know, people are asking questions about, you know, like at the state level, you know, how might we do this? And I think that one piece of it that I think folks often miss is that we have opportunity. It's not like let's go look for an opportunity to do co-design. It's all the like think of we started a DT Rajendran, who's one of my doc students who worked with me on the project in the final chapter. We started realizing we need to say where are you making decisions that matter to students and families? Those are your opportunities for co-design. And that's just not to say that we're going to do that for every single kinds of thing. And at the same time, like if we can do that in some key places, then we begin to grow a certain kind of practice and some routines, and that we actually start having end goals that look different because we've engaged in processes that look different. I want to close. I want to say actually one thing. We did the drawing. The Teachers College Press folks found Patty Jomo is going to be the recipient of the free book. So congratulations, Patty. We'll follow up with you afterwards about that. And I guess I wanted to close and just have us talk a little bit about solidarity. That's a really different kind of aim, and I talk about this as well. That so much of so much of our scholarship and work has been premised on this idea of interest convergence. And Derek Bell's really powerful work. It came up also in the Nice White Parents about the idea of like when there are advances in racial justice, that they often they advance because it serves a particular interest, especially for white community, more privileged communities as well. And so one of the things that I'm sort of pushing out a little bit is how can we think about solidarity as a kind of organizing principle. So I wonder if you might each say maybe 30 seconds about why solidarity, where do you see that? How do you see that?
Well, I have no problem with interest convergence. That's an analytical frame that Derek Bell uses to analyze white supremacy and whiteness. As long and I see almost all white actions like that. Quite frankly, that's their business. We know what you're doing, but if you're going to put this resource here to help liberation, that's your business, right? In terms of solidarity, I'll say that I don't need white allies. I need white advocates. I need people to put it all on the line. I need people to step out and allow communities to self-determine where they want to be. And it's not only education goals like grades and attendance, right? It's community-based goals as well. There's so much more to say about that, but let me stop there and allow my sister to come in.
I would have said something just like what Muhammad said, but because you said it, I get to say this. One of my favorite parts of the book is the end around on solidarities. And I guess this is maybe my former preschool teacher self and mom self, but one of my favorite parts that you talked about, Ann, is that often when we're trying to work on solidarities, we do it from an adultified place that often reifies this view of like, there's almost only so much pie, right? Or there's only, and we're kind of fighting for a particular piece of a pie as a positioning, and it sets all kinds of things in motion that I think really are hard around the way that solidarities play out. And I'm not even talking about white families or white folks. I'm talking about across racialized communities in particular ways that I think is ongoing tension and work. But what I really love about what you did, and what I think I've also witnessed and watched you do, is say what happens when we talk about trying to be good to one another's families? What opens as a possible space of action? And your point about like, when you can get families to start seeing each other's humanities, our collective action, our capacity for collective solidarities completely amplifies, because now I don't want what's best for my kid to hurt your all's kids. That's not the ethic that I want them to learn. And I feel like it's where that possibility of where you end the book around solidarities, I think is also a real important lesson about theories of change for systems, but actually how we recapture our humanities collectively too.
Well, I wanted to say thank you to the two of you. You also make my work even better. So thank you so much to the two of you for being in conversation with me. And thank you for everybody for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you
for having us.
for inviting.
Yeah, congratulations on the book, Ann. Amazing.
Thank you.